Clergy sex abuse. A report by Catholic News Agency says Cardinal Donald Wuerl had known about allegations of misconduct against Archbishop Theodore Mccarrick for 14 years. We have analysis. Shutdown showdown. New developments in President Trump's attempt to build a border wall. Catholic concerns. Why a chapel in Texas is at the heart of the security wall debate. And right at home, Pope Francis surprises a group of cloistered nuns in Italy. We'll tell you its connection to our very own Mother Angelica. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, January 11th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. A new revelation tonight in the sex abuse crisis. We are now learning Cardinal Donald Wuerl knew about sex abuse allegations against Archbishop Theodore Mccarrick, despite his denials. That's according to church officials. Until now, Wuerl said he did not learn of the claims until last year. In a letter last June, he said he was, quote, shocked and saddened by the allegations that had just been made public. But a spokesman for the Archdiocese of Washington confirms the cardinal forwarded an allegation to the Vatican Embassy in 2004 when he was Bishop of Pittsburgh. Wuerl resigned last October as Archbishop of Washington. Joining me now is Edward Condon, who broke the story with Editor-in-Chief J.D. Flynn for Catholic News Agency. So Ed, tell us what you know about the allegation itself and Wuerl's knowledge of it.
Well, we don't have the direct text of the allegation that was made. What we know is that a then priest of the Diocese of Metuchen in New Jersey, where then Bishop Mccarrick was the diocesan bishop, came to then Bishop Wuerl in Pittsburgh and said, I have an allegation to make of sexual misconduct against a different priest, a priest of Pittsburgh that was teaching at the time at Mount St. Mary's Seminary. He said, in the process of making that allegation, I also want to lodge a complaint about Bishop Mccarrick. And we don't know the exact nature of it, but what we do know is that it pretty much follows the pattern of similar allegations against Mccarrick to do with seminarians. The beach house, sharing a bed, offering and requesting back rubs, inappropriate touching, things of that nature. And the man who made this accusation to then Bishop Wuerl said, I want you to forward this to Rome. I want this to go to the nuncio. Please do that. And we now know that Wuerl did it.
Yeah, Cardinal Wuerl has insisted he knew nothing of Mccarrick's misconduct, of course. This is sure seen by so many people as another blow to the church's credibility. How do you think the leadership should move forward and respond?
It's very difficult to see a way forward for Cardinal Wuerl right now. I mean, this really is a blow to his credibility. He was very clear over the summer that he'd never even heard rumors of misconduct against then Cardinal Mccarrick and seminarians. So in the light of that, learning that he had received one of these accusations himself in 2004, it becomes very hard to stack that against his credibility.
In a bombshell letter, Archbishop Carlo Vigano, the former papal nuncio in Washington, claimed Cardinal Wuerl knew about Mccarrick's abuse. Does this prove Vigano was right?
I don't think it proves or disproves Vigano was right with regards to what he wrote about Cardinal Wuerl. Specifically, what he wrote about Wuerl was that while then Cardinal Mccarrick was retired and living in the Archdiocese of Washington, Cardinal Wuerl knew about certain restrictions or provisions, or the language for what to call them is very hotly debated, but certain conditions placed on the living of then Cardinal Mccarrick while he was retired in D.C. Now, Wuerl says he had no knowledge of any such things, and Archbishop Vigano says he absolutely did. This doesn't prove or disprove that, but again, it's another serious chip out of Cardinal Wuerl's credibility.
A new Gallup poll today finds only 31% of U.S. Catholics rate honesty and ethical standards of clergy as very high or high. Only 31%. So meanwhile, a Vatican official is calling all of the coverage of the abuse crisis excessive. Do you think the Vatican will listen to this?
I think the Pope, at least, has understood that this is happening. When the U.S. bishops all met at Mundelein Seminary last week for their week-long retreat, which the Pope had pretty much ordered them to go on, he sent them a letter in which he said the crisis of credibility of the hierarchy in this country was a real problem, and it was the first thing the bishops needed to address, that they had lost their authority, and they lost it by being unfaithful to the faithful in the sense that they didn't handle these sexual abuse crisis problems correctly, and they didn't have communion amongst themselves. And that's what he ordered them to fix first of all. So at least the Pope understands that the church's credibility is on the line here.
Okay. We'll be watching to see how much more they say in February where they meet. And of course, you guys will continue to cover all of this and find more details. Edward Condon, the Washington, D.C. editor for Catholic News Agency. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
A Catholic priest in Pennsylvania who pleaded guilty to sexually abusing 2 boys will serve between 2.5 and 14 years in prison. David Lee Paulson was charged following the state's grand jury report. He made one of his victims go to confession afterward. Maryland's Attorney General unveils a hotline to report clergy sex abuse. The announcement was made in Baltimore, home of the country's first bishop, first cathedral, and first diocese. The state has not formally announced a probe into clergy sex abuse. President Trump says he's not looking to declare a national emergency to build a border right now. That's up to Congress, he says. Funding for that wall is at the sticking point, really, in the shutdown, now on day 21. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reports. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. The House is moving ahead with spending bills to fund federal agencies, but Senate Republicans say they will not consider them until the president gets money for a border wall. That means 800,000 federal workers won't be paid today.
We have been locked in a nonsensical shutdown.
On that, both sides can agree.
This situation should not exist.
President Trump says he won't agree to fund the government until he gets $5.7 billion for a wall. Democrats still say, no way.
We are the policy makers of government, not to sit as stooges and be told by the President of the United States, if you don't do what I want, what I tell you to do, I won't sign the bill.
After 21 days, Republican Lindsey Graham says Congress cannot make a deal.
I have never been more depressed about moving forward than right now. I just don't see a pathway forward.
Graham urges the president, declare emergency, build the wall now. Despite that plea, the president now says he will not declare an emergency so fast. It should be a relief to some lawmakers in the president's own party.
As the Apostle Paul once said, all things are lawful, not necessarily expedient. Basically what it means, we need to do our job in the United States Congress to be able to, whether it's funding, whatever it might be, it all originates in the Congress.
And on the first payday, without a paycheck, affected government workers wait for the shutdown to end.
And the American people are being denied vital services, all because of President Trump's demands for a wasteful border wall.
The House and Senate both passed a bill to make sure federal workers will get back pay once the government reopens. Now, that includes those furloughed who are not working, as well as those deemed essential and still on the job. The president is expected to sign this bill. Wyatt?
Well, Jason, in the meantime, what are those workers doing to make ends meet?
That's a good question, since many Americans really live paycheck to paycheck. Now, some workers are launching GoFundMe campaigns. Others are scaling back spending or canceling trips, dipping into their savings, or even applying for unemployment. This is their second week since their last paycheck.
Okay, Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting on this. Thanks, Jason. The Trump administration isn't backing down from its pledge to build a border wall. Vice President Mike Pence says the situation is worse than under Barack Obama in 2014.
In the last month, we saw more than 10,000 families and unaccompanied children attempt to come across our border. That was 10,000 more than when President Obama called it a humanitarian crisis.
The vice president was speaking at the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol headquarters in Washington, D.C. He reiterates the Trump administration will keep fighting to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. While President Trump's battle for the wall continues in Washington, a group of Catholics along the Rio Grande River pray they don't lose their cherished 19th century chapel. White House correspondent Mark Irons joins us with that story from Mission, Texas. Good evening, Mark.
Wyatt, La Lamita Chapel behind me has been serving this community for more than 100 years. Now, Mission, Texas was actually named after the chapel's founding by missionaries, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. People come here to pray, celebrate masses, baptisms, weddings. But these days, churchgoers fear that a border wall could cut them off from a holy place. Mass begins before sunrise.
And help us always to show your kindness to strangers.
As a candlelit congregation of longtime churchgoers huddles together at La Lamita Chapel. Some 50 yards from this holy site, the Rio Grande River levee, where President Trump's border wall could one day stand. The barrier would separate U.S. churchgoers on one side, the chapel on the other. The local Brownsville diocese isn't waiting for that day, pushing back in court now. And even if the government paid for the land, one man isn't interested.
We could raffle off a truck and make that kind of money. We don't want to sell our mother's church, our holy. That wouldn't work for us at all.
Some call him the cowboy priest. Father Roy Snipes is a willing fighter for La Lamita, having overseen the chapel for more than 20 years.
It's a sacred place, but evidently they're already telling us, we want your place. Thank you for coming, y'all.
Right now, the U.S. government is arguing a preliminary survey of the land wouldn't violate the rights of visitors. But these longtime La Lamita regulars have seen the wall go up in different parts of South Texas and can imagine a future structure infringing on their right to worship.
We feel angry that we wouldn't be able to have direct access to it.
It's scary and it's sad.
The first start is always a little tricky.
Father Roy has heard President Trump declare a crisis on the border, but he says the nearby Rio Grande River that divides Mexico and the U.S. gives him peace. The Catholic Church allows countries to secure their borders if it's for the good of the people in their country. Do you think that's not needed here?
No. I don't think anybody would say we should just have an open border. I think everybody would say we ought to work something out.
But a wall here, he says, is not the solution. If President Trump's plans become reality, La Lamita Chapel would end up in what Father Roy calls a no-man's land, stuck between the Rio Grande and the border wall. So, what would he say to the president?
Listen to the Spirit. The Spirit's got something to tell you, and I don't think this is it.
And Wyatt, to update you on the legal proceedings surrounding this case, just this week the government told a judge that the church's challenge is premature because the government hasn't decided how to use this land, and taking possession, they say, would not cause a, quote, substantial burden on the diocese's exercise of its religious beliefs. Of course, Wyatt, the diocese isn't backing down.
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting from Mission, Texas. Thanks, Mark. Later in the broadcast, a lawyer who served on President Trump's transition team tells us how the White House could use emergency powers to fund the border wall. The United States has begun to withdraw military equipment from Syria. Defense officials declined giving any specifics, and it's unclear if any troops also have left. There are 2,000 soldiers stationed in the country. They have been there since 2014, fighting Islamic State militants. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is talking about the withdrawal of troops during his 9-nation tour of the Middle East. Today he was in Bahrain meeting with King Hamad. He said the withdrawal of troops from Syria does not mean Washington will abandon the region, and they will continue to fight against ISIS in the war on terror. Pompeo also is calling for increased pressure on Tehran. Catholic bishops in Venezuela call President Nicolas Maduro's second term illegitimate. He was sworn in yesterday, but church officials question the vote which re-elected him last summer. The United States and 16 other countries also say they will not recognize his second term. Maduro's socialist government is widely blamed for the country's current economic crisis. An estimated 3 million people have fled Venezuela since 2014. The runner-up in the presidential election in Congo is declaring victory. Martin Fayulu will file a court challenge. He says data from Catholic leaders shows he won 61% of the vote. The church organized 40,000 observers for the election late last year. Felix Tshisekedi was declared the winner this week. France's biggest clergy sex abuse trial is likely to end in acquittal for a cardinal accused of protecting a pedophile priest. Cardinal Philippe Barbarin of Lyon is accused of failing to protect children, many of them Boy Scouts, from abuse. He says he's innocent of the claims. A verdict is expected in March. The allegedly abusive priest faces a separate trial. The priest has confessed to misconduct in letters to the families of his victims. Joining us now is Arthur Herline, Rome Bureau Chief for iMedia Agency, a French news service. Arthur, here in the U.S., we are dealing with our own clergy sex abuse crisis. How are the French reacting to this case in particular?
Actually, the French opinion is quite divided. The Catholics are just few protecting the bishop, the Cardinal Barbarin, but most of the people are quite worried by the Catholic Church in France.
Well, let's talk more about that in general, because a top Vatican official in charge of the sex abuse cases is among the accused, but won't appear in court because the Vatican invoked his diplomatic immunity. So can you give us a wider sense then of how the French think the Vatican is handling the sex abuse crisis in general?
Yeah, actually, all started with a letter that the French police founded in the Archbishop's palace in Lyon, where it was written that, so it was Cardinal Ladaria who wrote it when he was secretary of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. And he was saying more or less, do everything you can to avoid the scandal. So when the police founded that letter, when the victims of the Father Prena, who did the sexual abuses, when they learned that, they decided to ask to Cardinal Ladaria to come in France to participate at the trial. But actually, yeah, the Vatican didn't accept it, and they used the diplomatic immunity.
What do you think about the future of the church in general? How do you feel? Are you pessimistic, optimistic?
It's kind of half, because right now the situation is really, really bad in France. We have a really strong laicity. This winter, the state has forbidden to every town hall in France to install its own nativity scene. So you can see that the church is quite in a bad position. And we also have a big problem with the lack of priests in France, because only 100 of priests are ordinating every year, so it's nothing.
Okay, so lots of things the Catholic community will be praying for, the future of the church in France, as well as obviously vocations. Arthur Herline, Rome Bureau Chief for the French Media Agency, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thank you very much.
The Vatican announces Pope Francis will travel to Romania. The 3-day trip begins at the end of May. It will be exactly 20 years after Pope John Paul II was the first pope to visit the country. There's more on the broadcast coming up next. A lawyer tells us why declaring a national emergency would allow the president to fund his border wall without approval from Congress. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Republican Congressman Steve King of Iowa is defending himself after criticism for making allegedly racist comments.
As I told the New York Times, it's not about race. It's never been about race. One of my most strongly held beliefs is that we are all created in God's image, and that human life is sacred in all of its forms.
On the House floor, King said he rejected white nationalism and white supremacy and their evil ideology. King, a Catholic convert, says he is simply a nationalist. President Trump seems to be putting the idea of declaring a national emergency on hold. He was floating the idea to fund a border wall. Joining me now is Ken Klukowsky, Senior Counsel and Director of Strategic Affairs at First Liberty Institute. Ken, welcome back. Legally, can the president declare a national emergency to fund something like this?
Yes, he can, Wyatt. Under the National Emergencies Act of 1976, which is 50 U.S.C. 1601, the president can declare a national emergency for any reason he sees fit. And in fact, since Carter, 58 national emergencies have been declared. 31 of those are still in effect, including the very first one that Carter declared in 1979. And these deal with everything from Venezuela to drug trafficking to narcotics. Of course, drug issues are central to what's going on with the wall. If the president were to declare a national emergency, then under 33 U.S.C. Section 2293, he can order the Secretary of Defense to divert the Army Corps of Engineers and other construction units in the U.S. military to use military funding to fund the wall, and there is currently $13.9 billion of unspent money sitting in that account that could be used.
If he does that, he would get some backlash from Congress. What about Congress' role in emergency funds like this? Can they do anything?
Congress's role is to actually appropriate funds, and they've already done that, so this is legally appropriated funds. Regarding other matters, in the case of an emergency, emergency. You don't need authorizing legislation. But in fact, more than a decade ago, Congress enacted a law authorizing the construction of a border fence as well. So even though that statutory authority is not necessary, Congress has already given to them, and it would take a new law to actually repeal that. And I think we know that a law like that would not, certainly wouldn't get past the Senate, and the president would just veto it if it did.
Congressional Republicans are split on whether President Trump should use his executive power. How do you think, if he did do it, it would impact his relationship with lawmakers?
Well, I support the president's attempts to negotiate with Congress, trying to win congressional leaders over. I think in a democracy, it's always better when you can actually bring both parties to the table, get everyone can shake hands, everyone can declare victory. Now, in this case, now that Speaker Pelosi has called it immoral, I'm not sure we're going to win her back. But we have to remember there's roughly 40 freshman Democrats in the U.S. House, most of them winning districts that Trump had won, that the president had won, and that were held by Republicans. You can see, hearing from their comments over the past few days, they're feeling the heat, and I think the president is starting to win some of them over. If he does not manage to win enough over, then he always has this in the back pocket, that he already has lawful authority to construct the wall.
That sort of connects to my next question, because this shutdown is now on the verge of being the longest one ever.
That's right.
How do you think this plays out in the next week?
I think that the longer this shutdown goes on, I think the president holds the high ground here, both legally and in terms of public perception. I think it's those freshmen or two-term members of Congress, especially in the House, who are especially vulnerable from this. They're the ones who I think are going to start hearing from their constituents, especially since when you word the question correctly, most Americans support securing the border. You get people who come up with catchwording, and it kind of generates some bad poll numbers because it uses a buzzword that scares people. But border security numbers are popular with the American people, and I think members of Congress, you're hearing how they are getting phone calls about it.
Okay, we'll continue to follow this. Ken Klukowsky, Senior Director in Strategic Affairs at First Liberty Institute, thanks so much.
Thanks, Wyatt.
There's so much more on the broadcast. Up next, Pope Francis pays another surprise visit. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. The Little Sisters of the Poor were back in court this week. Two states, California and Pennsylvania, are challenging the order's religious exemption from the HHS contraception mandate. At least one of the decisions is expected early next week. A county in North Carolina will no longer open its commission meetings with Christian prayers. Rowan County must also pay the American Civil Liberties Union nearly $300,000 in legal fees. The ACLU represented 3 residents who sued over the prayer. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the county's appeal. More than 2,000 pilgrims gather in the Jordan to mark the baptism of Jesus Christ. The group included refugees from Iraq and Syria. Christians believe Christ was baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. It is considered the third most important site of Christianity after the places where Christ was born and where he was buried and rose from the dead. And finally tonight, a group of cloistered nuns in Italy welcomes an unexpected visitor. He traveled 2 hours to talk with them about prayer. The guest, Pope Francis. He was joined by a local bishop. The private and informal visit included Mass, then the group enjoyed lunch together. The Holy Father expressed his admiration for the Poor Clare nuns and their vocation for contemplative life. And of course, our own Mother Angelica was a member of one of the branches of the Poor Clares. Mother went to be with the Lord almost 3 years ago, but her legacy lives on. And with that, we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back on Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.